So thank you everybody for joining today's meeting of the Regional Transportation Advisory Council. All participants will join today's meeting with muted microphones. If you could please rename yourself to include both your first name, last name, and your affiliation, should you have one, that would be fantastic. To participate in today's discussion, if you could please use the raise hand function, that would be great, just to keep a sense of order within the meeting. Depending on which version of Zoom you have, you can find this in a number of areas. You might find it at the bottom of your screen, right in the bottom bar. You might need to click on the reactions button. And if you don't see it in either of those places, try clicking on the participants button and you will likely see it there. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand and *6 to mute and unmute yourself. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can get in touch with me, Matt Archer, via the chat box at marcher@ctps.org or at 857-702-3708. And with that, Len, I will toss it back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Archer. And so we are going to forego the introductions of people here now, just to allow Mr. Raifman more time to talk about his paper and whatever else. But when you decide to ask a question, if you decide to ask a question, maybe you can take that opportunity to introduce yourself, and then maybe later on in the meeting we'll do a round about if there's time. So with that, I am so happy to turn things over to Matthew Raifman, who, as you all know, has written a paper that I think is very interesting and timely for the region in terms of what we will decide to do in the near future with respect to our transportation plans, especially as involves our concern about climate change, and active transportation. So with that, Matt.
All right, let's get the screen share going. One sec. Okay. How's that look to you?
Almost fine to me.
Okay, good. One thing I want to say, if you hear a banging, it's on my microphone. They're actually replacing our roof, so it's kind of a annoying situation, but hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
So, hi everyone, my name is Matt Raifman. As Len said, I'm at the Boston University School of Public Health. I'm in the Department of Environmental Health as a PhD student. This is a presentation kind of extensively about our paper, and then more broadly about these themes around active mobility and health impacts of transportation policies and investments. The work for our paper was supported by the Barr Foundation. It's part of a collaboration with Harvard School of Public Health, Columbia University, and University of North Carolina called TREC, which is a study to look at the health impacts of different scenarios associated with the Transportation Climate Initiative. And so just a little bit about me, or maybe a fair amount about me. As I mentioned, I'm a PhD student. My research is focusing, I'd say, in these two different buckets. The first one is looking at health impacts of climate mitigation and transport policy. An example of a study like that is the one I'm going to talk about today. Another one that I worked on with my advisor, Pat Kinney at BU as well. He worked on the Transportation Climate Initiative paper. We looked at the health impacts of the City of Boston's Climate Action Plan. Another area of research I've been looking at is health disparities by race and ethnicity of different exposures. And so some of that's been transportation related, particularly related to active mobility. So walking and biking fatality rates by race and ethnicity, they're not the same, unfortunately. Also differential exposure to roadway exposure to NO2, nitrogen dioxide by race and ethnicity, as well as some COVID-19 related work that doesn't have a transportation bent. And then I'm sort of a mid-career PhD student. Before getting into the research field, I worked at Ford Smart Mobility most recently, where I launched autonomous vehicle pilots and e-scooter pilots. Also before that, I worked at Bloomberg Philanthropies and the governor's office in Maryland, where I worked on data-driven decision-making in public service. So just to give you a little bit of context, like who I am and what my background is. So I thought maybe just to start, a little bit of background on health and climate impacts of transportation and how these three areas, health, climate, and transportation, are all interrelated. And I don't expect this to be a particular surprise for any of you. You probably have all seen a chart similar to this or this specific one. But transport in the United States, the transportation sector is now the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And that happened about 5 years ago, mainly driven by the decline in electricity share, but also reflective of a lack of transition that's happening in the transportation sector, where basically we've been at the same kind of level for a while. And of that slice of the pie that's transportation, light duty vehicles represent the largest share. And the reason why I mention that is because, as you know, light duty vehicles really reflect our commuting patterns as individuals in society, as opposed to shipping concerns or airplane travel and things like that. And the reason why commuting is interesting to me, and I think relevant to this discussion, is we very much live in a single occupancy vehicle world, and we still do. This is the most recent American Community Survey data on commuting patterns from 2015 to 2019, the 5-year survey. And of course, this is before COVID. So I will say an aside, our research is pre-COVID, and there is probably an interesting discussion to have today or elsewhere for you to have. I'm sure you're having this discussion about how any of these trends change after COVID and what we can do, to seize the opportunity maybe presented by COVID-19 and the change that's affecting on commuting patterns. But before COVID, we were very much in the Boston area, still reflective of where the trends are nationally. A little bit better in terms of the share of driving alone, about 2/3 as opposed to 3/4, and a little bit better in terms of the share of transit trips. But that's kind of to be expected from a urban center like ours. But as you can see, the big picture story here is still the same, right? That most trips in this country are driving alone in a single occupancy vehicle. Because of current uptake of electric vehicles, that vehicle tends to be powered by an internal combustion engine. It's emitting tailpipe emissions. It's emitting greenhouse gas emissions. And that's kind of this intersection around the transportation sector. I've been wanting to create a slide or a chart like this for some time. As I was reviewing some of the material for this presentation, I came across this chart, which I think really does what I would want to do, which is to compare apples to apples. What is the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions by vehicle mode per vehicle, in this case, kilometer traveled, but per mile traveled. And we can see that this relationship between transportation mode and greenhouse gas emissions is really reflected when you look at the magnitude of the difference between driving a private car alone and cycling or walking. Walking, of course, has no greenhouse gas emissions because it doesn't require any combustion. Cycling is very efficient as far as emissions go, with private bike being more efficient than an e-bike or a shared bike because of operational services and infrastructure components. But those pale in comparison to the magnitude of single occupancy vehicle trips. In fact, of all the modes listed, ride sourcing, taxis, mopeds, scooters, personal occupancy vehicles are the least efficient from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective. And I think one other nuance to this chart, that I think is interesting for discussion, is we're considering, I think, as a society, a lot of the implications around investment in transportation and specifically battery electric vehicles. And we are talking about this in the context of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. But if you look in detail here, comparing, for example, this line here, which is an internal combustion engine vehicle, to a battery electric vehicle, yes, the battery electric private car is less, right? The fuel share of emissions is much smaller, but it's still a lot larger than these other active modes, perhaps double the magnitude of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that context is sometimes lost when we're talking about transportation and climate change. And so I offer that kind of background around climate change to give you that climate change focus of active mobility. And then on the health side of the coin, I think there's a really interesting and complicated relationship with health. And I like this visualization because I think it captures that regardless of the mode that we consider, whether it's cars or even bikes. There's beneficial aspects of that mode, and then there's detrimental aspects to health of that mode. And they vary, right, in magnitude depending on the mode, but there's still benefits and detrimental effects of everything that we do. Even something like physical activity, like, for example, cycling to work, is much better than driving a car, as I mentioned, for greenhouse gases or air pollution. But there's heightened risk of traffic fatality or severe injury, at least based on our road system in the United States, when biking versus driving a car. And so even in just cycling, we see this kind of positive impact from a climate change and air quality perspective, and also a negative impact of potential heightened risk of traffic fatalities. And so that kind of positive and negative cost benefit analysis, if you will, is something that needs to be accounted for and thought about in all the different modes of transportation, regardless of if it's active mobility or a combustion vehicle. Another thing kind of to put into context is, you think about a car, and yes, we talk a lot about air pollution and greenhouse gases and these types of issues, but a car may also offer mobility independence to somebody who doesn't have an ability to use public transit. And so even within vehicles and internal combustion engines that have these environmental effects, from a social perspective, there could actually be these positive impacts as well, like independence and access. And so that's just an example kind of how I think about it. And I think a lot in the field are thinking about these things. We want to look at, from a health perspective, the pros and the cons, and account for both of those in whatever modeling or whatever analysis we're doing. And within active mobility specifically, which is extensively kind of what our paper is focused on and what I'm here to talk about with you, there's been a fair amount of research that's looked at the relationship between active modes of transportation, and perhaps I should pause and define that. My kind of working definition of active mobility is a transportation mode that burns calories. And I think that's kind of the simplest, most refined way to think about it. Therefore, obviously walking and cycling burn calories. E-bikes burn calories because you're doing pedal assist and you're still pedaling to generate energy for the battery. Something like an electric scooter could be an active mode or could not be an active mode, depending on how it's implemented. So if you have an electric scooter at your house and you walk downstairs and you get on the street right on the electric scooter and you go to your destination and you park it and you go to your workplace, that's not really an active form of mobility because you didn't burn any calories, additional calories over that trip. But if you're doing a shared electric scooter and you're walking half a mile to the scooter location and you're hopping on the scooter, you've now walked an extra half a mile. So that is an active form of mobility based on that trip. So that's kind of the working way that I've been thinking about it. But in essence, all these active modes are active because they're increasing the level of physical activity of the individual. And so there's been research in a lot of different areas that have shown positive health impacts of increased physical activity. So at the kind of the bigger picture, all-cause mortality, which is essentially a bucket for any fatality cause, has been shown to decrease with additional activity per week. Breast and colon cancer as well, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, some neurodegenerative illnesses like dementia and a couple other ones actually that were researched by Hamer in this paper were lower. The association was a decrease in incidence and prevalence of those illnesses with increased activity, as well as depression and improved mental health. And then on kind of the other side, as I mentioned before, there's been a fair amount of research that's looked at the relationship between active forms of transportation, specifically walking and biking, and traffic fatalities. And there is a heightened risk. There's an increased risk of injury when using these modes. And so that's on the other side of the spectrum. So this is kind of the big picture of the health impacts or the operationalized sort of health impacts that go into a lot of these health impact assessments that look at how transportation mode impacts public health. And an area of, I would say, maybe burgeoning research or maybe just an area of research that I think is really interesting is how these two worlds of air pollution and active mobility intersect and they interact. And what you're looking at here is a chart. It's a little bit complicated, but on the the x-axis, you see cycling minutes per day. So going from 0 to 600 minutes or 10 hours of cycling a day, which would be a little insane. And then on the y-axis, you see the relative risk of all-cause mortality. So a lower value on the y-axis is a greater impact or improvement in health from active mobility. And so you see this tipping point here, which I think is really interesting. And what this is saying is essentially that beyond this point, so if you're cycling more than, say, around 90 minutes per day, the negative impacts of being exposed to air pollution are greater than the physical activity benefits of increased activity. And that's a factor of a couple different things, but in essence, when we're active in an environment, we're breathing in more air, our respiratory rate is faster, and we're taking in more of whatever air is around us. And so if that's polluted air, we're being exposed to that polluted air more frequently and in greater concentrations. And that's a detrimental effect on our health. And of course, we're being active, and so there's some benefit from our activity, but that cancels out at about 90 minutes. And I should say, this is for a very high level of background air pollution. So you see up here, this is for 50 micrograms per meter cubed. In Boston, it's around 10 or 12. And so this tipping point is actually probably even further to the right. We could go even more activity, like say 2 hours hypothetically, or even higher. And the point of this, the big picture is that even though there are maybe some negative impacts from an air quality perspective of cycling or walking, aggressively in an environment because you're breathing in this pollution, you have to do a lot of it in a day, and a lot more than the average commute, in order for the negative impacts to outweigh the benefits. Or flipped, we can be very active in these forms of mobility in our commuting patterns without seeing negative impacts overcome the positive benefits to us of that increased activity. And so that's kind of the background around transportation health. I see I have a comment. I wanted to pause and maybe see if folks had questions before I go into some of the more detail on the paper that we did. Oh, and I should also say Pat Kinney, who's my advisor, has hopped in the meeting and can also answer questions. He noted that the level I was talking about, 50 micrograms, is about similar to Beijing right now, as opposed to Boston.
Andy?
So, one thought that I had, I work for the city of Cambridge, and I'm a transit planner, but in my department, we also have our bike planning, pedestrian planning, all the kind of transportation planning folks. So this is really interesting. I'm just excited to see kind of all these things put together in one spot. I did just want to note, one thing that I've read in research has been kind of the kind of crash related kind of negative effects for cycling kind of have a kind of wide smattering of different type of facility types, and we know that facility type really does drive a lot of the safety and the kind of hazard, the kind of crashes that we may be considering. I'm wondering if you've seen any research that kind of takes into consideration the different types of facilities, because I feel like a lot has happened in the past 5 years in particular around different types of facilities that may not be reflected in some older research. I just wasn't sure if you've seen that, and secondarily, whether you've seen some research into facility type and exposure to pollutants, because I know actually a lot of people think of being in a bike lane as the lane right next to the cars, so there must be a lot of bad things, but some of the new facility types give you more distance from a safety perspective, but also change the relationship that you have with the vehicles themselves too, for a pollutant perspective as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Really interesting. So on the first bit, looking at differential fatality rates by facility type, for example, you're right in that a lot of the research I've seen does not take that into account, and that is a big gap. And I think that gap is driven primarily by the lack of good exposure data at the facility level. So we don't have good data sets on the number of people biking in a protected bike lane in a city versus a side of the road bike lane. I've often pined, wouldn't it be amazing if we could use geolocation data in a deaggregated way, like from Google or Apple or something, where people are biking and their location is tracked, and therefore we could see, roughly in aggregate what the utilization is on these different types of facilities. There is some interesting research that looks at, I've actually looked into this because I think it's really interesting. And so there is some research that looks at kind of creative ways using something called a case control study and create case crossover studies. But essentially what they've done is they've looked at people who have gotten injured, and they've gone to the emergency room and they've looked at their route, the route that they took when they got injured. And they've randomly chosen different points along that route as alternative realities, essentially. And in that research, they've shown that these protect exactly what we'd expect intuitively, that these protected bike lanes, whether it's by like concrete bollards or metal bollards or a separate lane altogether, are safer. But there isn't a ton of research in that space. And I think it's because of the lack of good exposure data. We have a lot of information on the fatality side. We know where people are injured or where more likely where they die. We have that data to a fine location level, but we don't have the larger data sets on where people are biking and what magnitude it is. And then the second question you asked was around proximity, or I was thinking about proximity to roadway and pollution. So we know with certain particulates like NO2, they degrade very quickly from the roadway. So certain pollutants, they basically tail off very quickly from the roadway over hundreds of feet. And so if you place the bike lane 300 or 400 feet away from that roadway, it should have better, lower air quality exposure than if you place it right on the roadway. Other pollutants are more dispersed in the environment, and therefore they're not as, there isn't necessarily as much of a benefit. But intuitively, like being close to the tailpipe is going to expose you to higher levels of particulates as well as NO2. So yeah, it's an interesting area of research, and I think we're getting there, and there's some research in that space, but not a ton.
All right, Galen.
Excellent, thanks. This is awesome, first off, and I want to say this is going to be very helpful for our advocacy. My name is Galen Luke. I'm the director of the Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition. We do statewide bike advocacy. So first, I just want to say thanks. And my question is, and maybe this is begging it, that you're probably going to talk about it later, but I'm wondering the collective nature versus the singular use nature. It's been pretty widely accepted that the more bikers that are out there, per capita crash rates go down, basically because we're assuming that drivers and the infrastructure kind of fits the need of the demand and people just get more used to cycling. So I'm wondering if your data shows this, and maybe it's projecting into the future of like exponentially, if we get more ridership of bicyclists in particular, the per capita crashes may go down even if the rates stay pretty high. And I'm wondering if that is going to be represented in this as well. And then second question along those lines, are you mapping this to the projected goals that the state has, or even the cities have in terms of mode shift? So if we get to, 7 or 10% of the population actually going by bike, what does that actually do for safety out there? And I'm using this with a cyclist mindset because that's just where my myopic advocacy forces me to be right here. But hopefully those questions make sense.
Yeah, definitely do. So on the second question first, we haven't done that with this research, but we're actually thinking about mapping to different kind of bicycle and walking saturation levels. And so that's a really interesting observation about maybe looking at the policy objectives. And so that's something I think we can take back and think about as a potential scenario essentially to look at. But we haven't done that yet. The scenarios that we use in the paper that I'll talk about are driven by the Transportation Climate Initiative's investment kind of structure and isn't as integrated, I think, into some of the policy objectives ostensibly. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but in terms of the scenarios that we looked at, we didn't look at it in terms of the share of bicyclists that are commuting mode share that is bicycling. We looked at it as investment in infrastructure types and what the impact would be. The first question, sorry, can you just remind me really quickly what the first question was about?
Yeah, I guess it was just the idea of more ridership out there. So it's like,
oh yeah, safety and numbers.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, so we do actually incorporate, our analysis is not, we're really doing an impact assessment. So we're kind of looking at this from a policy perspective and trying to assess the health impacts. But we do utilize underlying research that looks exactly at this issue, and we incorporate that into our analysis. But you're right, there is research out there supporting this idea that if there are more cyclists out there, and I imagine it also, actually some of it does extend to pedestrians as well, then they're more visible. That's one theory, but essentially there is a reduced, it attenuates the potential risk of walking or cycling when you have larger groups of people out there. And so we do incorporate that into the analysis.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks. That's it for the questions.
Okay, cool. Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Great.
No problem.
Okay, so our study, is focused on mortality implications, so deaths avoided potentially from increased active mobility associated with the Transportation Climate Initiative, which is a cap and invest program that I'll explain in a little bit in detail. I worked on this with Pat Kinney, who's on the call, as well as the collaborators at BU and Harvard School of Public Health, and it was published in the Journal of Urban Health earlier this year. It's part of this bigger study called TREC, which I would encourage all of you to look at. I can share a link somehow to the materials that we've put together summarizing the results. The study in aggregate looked at both the active mobility aspects, which I'll talk about, as well as air quality impacts, which is a separate aspect of this work. And it was supported, as I mentioned, by the Barr Foundation. Oh, hold on. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I'm not sure how many people are familiar with market-based solutions kind of to greenhouse gas emissions issues, but I think many of us have heard about the RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And this is an initiative that was started in 2009. It's been running for over 10 years now. It's the first multi-state market-based solution or program aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions for the power sector exclusively. And the idea is to set a cap for the amount of emissions coming from power plants, and then ratchet that down, lower that essentially every year, so that you're kind of forcing the market to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then there's a trading mechanism built in. So any entity that's polluting more than it should or more than it's allowed to purchases an allowance, and then that allowance creates proceeds because of that purchase. And allowances can be traded between different polluting power plants. And so that's this predecessor to TCI. And they're not connected in a legal sense, but wait, sorry. Oh, okay, I'm in a side order, but they're not connected in a legal sense. But that's really the inspiration, I think, for these market-based solutions around transportation. And so the Transportation Climate Initiative is a initiative that's aimed at creating a market for allowances around emissions, specifically from the transportation sector. So reducing transportation sector greenhouse gas emissions for the entire region of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. They've been in discussions for a couple years. There are 13 states in total that have been part of these discussions. As of December of last year, 3 states, as well as Washington, D.C., signed MOUs, Memorandum of Understandings, that essentially pull them into this program and make it official. And the launch is expected next year. And it's only launching for these 4 geographic areas right now. Our analysis, which was started well before December of 2020, is looking at what the impacts might be across the entire region. So all the states you see here, regardless of their color, we've included all of those, and we've done our analysis at the county level. And that was designed to inform the process that was underway, as well as to produce academic research to help evaluate what the health impacts might be from different scenario options that the Transportation Climate Initiative is considering. And so market-based solution, I don't want to spend too much time on this unless folks are interested in the nitty-gritty, the detail, but essentially what differentiates the TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative, from what we would typically think of as a cap and trade system. What makes this cap and invest is that the investment happens on the back end. And so the money that's generated from the TCI is then reinvested into sustainable transportation initiatives like electrification or bikes. And that creates, ideally, a virtuous cycle. So you drop the greenhouse gas emissions targets every year, that generates proceeds through a process of the allowances. That money is invested into other initiatives that further lower greenhouse gas emissions, and that's kind of the objective of the program. And these reinvestments are interesting and relevant from a kind of decision-making perspective, because there's a large gamut of different approaches. There's personal vehicle fleet electrification and charging infrastructure, but there's also investment in walking and biking infrastructure, as well as investment in public transit capacity. And so what our research is doing is utilizing some scenarios that were created by the Transportation Climate Initiative to evaluate what the relative health impacts would be of different scenarios and different caps. And so taking that from a greenhouse gas emissions cap to mortality impacts and active mobility, that's what this kind of schematic is designed to show you. The TCI greenhouse gas emissions cap would lead to proceeds from the allowance structure. Those proceeds are invested by the states in many different things, but one of the things they could invest in would be walking and cycling infrastructure. That investment in walking and cycling infrastructure, different types of infrastructure, for example, in the model, which was our partners in this effort, Cambridge Systematics, were working on this work with Georgetown University and the Transportation Climate Initiative. And so we used scenarios that they generated and analyzed in their model. And so these different types of investments in walking and cycling infrastructure would generate estimated increases in walking and cycling miles traveled. And there are two pathways that increase in activity could affect health and specifically mortality for our analysis. The top one is improved health from physical activity. We are more active, as I was talking about before. We're less likely to die, basically, given our baseline risk, and therefore there's a benefit. And then on the downside, as we talked about before, there is a small heightened risk of traffic fatality, which would make it more likely that one might die if they switch modes. And so our analysis is incorporating the net impact of those two mechanisms, right? It's the fewer deaths per year minus the increased deaths per year, and then we get a net impact from a mortality perspective for that investment in walking and cycling infrastructure. And so that's the model that we're approaching here. So for this analysis, we looked at 9 total scenarios, and there are 3 different there are 3 different greenhouse gas emissions caps, and there are 3 different investment strategies. And so there are 9 permutations of the 2 of them. So from the greenhouse gas emissions cap perspective, this is all generated by the interest around the Transportation Climate Initiative and what they want to look at. We looked at 20, 22, and 25% reduction compared to a baseline year of 2023. And this would be a reduction, I believe, achieved over 10 years. So ratcheting down to these levels by 2033. So those are kind of the 3 caps. And then the 3 investment scenarios are the ones you see on the screen. I don't want to spend too much time on this unless you would like to. The big picture, though, here is there are multiple investment buckets, as I mentioned before, which is the left column. You have electrification opportunities, you have investment in transit infrastructure, whatever. And we're specifically looking at bicycle and pedestrian investment, which are the ones outlined in red for our analysis. And the other thing to note is that there are 3 different scenarios with different levels of investment per year. And so the way to read this is to say, under scenario A, the average annual investment in biking infrastructure across the entire region is $320 million per year. And so that's kind of the structure to our analysis. 3 different investment scenarios, 3 different cap scenarios.
Matthew, just let me jump in here.
Please.
I see a question, and it's up to you to determine how you want to deal with things. You have about a half hour left. So do you want to take questions now, or do you want to wait until then?
I think I'm pretty close to the end. I have 5 or 6 more slides, so maybe I'll finish up and then we can just do 20 minutes of questions at the end.
Okay, great. So hang in there, John. All right.
Thanks for understanding.
Sure, no problem.
So, okay, sorry. So results. So I just wanted to share kind of the results with you, and then happy to take questions and have a discussion. So we looked at 9 different scenarios. Here I'm just sharing 5 of those because I didn't want to overwhelm. And the top row here is examining, this is the net deaths avoided from biking and walking for each scenario across the entire region. And this incorporates the benefits from increased activity, the potential increase in fatalities from additional activity, the small increase in transit walking. So if there is an investment in transit infrastructure and more people would take transit, we assume that people would walk to and from the transit station a quarter of a mile. And so that's incorporated into this as well. And then we do incorporate as well a concept of safety in numbers, which is, as that mode share increases, or as we see more bikes on the road, there is safety, a reduction in the fatality rate associated with that. So that's what this top row is showing you. What I'd note here would be that there's variance across the different scenarios. This is reflecting the impact of different investment structures and the amount of resources that are invested in walking and cycling. We've monetized these health benefits, these mortality impacts, using a value of a statistical life approach. And we've estimated what the monetized annual benefits would be for each scenario per year. And so what you see here, just kind of focusing on this column, is we estimate, there is a potential to reduce fatalities across the region by 770 people per year. The monetized valuation of that would be about $7.4 billion using a value of a statistical life approach. And the bottom is the amount of money that was invested in infrastructure across the region. And so this is, $0.64 billion, $640 million were invested in walking and cycling infrastructure in this scenario. And so when you look at this, what speaks to me about this is not necessarily that this is a perfect cost benefit analysis, because it's not, but the magnitude of the difference between health impacts, valuation of health impacts, and the cost of the infrastructure that's being invested is so large. It's a tenfold increase here, 7.4 billion versus 0.64, that it's fairly reasonable to conclude that the health impacts of investing in this type of infrastructure exceed the costs of that infrastructure. And that's the case across the board for all the different scenarios that we looked at and that we modeled. One other thing I thought was interesting to point out is the importance of population density in this approach and this modeling structure. I apologize for kind of the busyness of this, but what we're looking at here is 5 different types of county by density. So New York City is sort of a density in itself, right? It's extremely dense. And a rural county is much, much less dense. And so this is kind of the 5 different categories of density. And as you look at the net deaths avoided per capita, which is this part outlined in red here, you can see this concentration of impacts, even after adjusting for population, in urban centers and urban core and New York City. And we can kind of talk about that. I think this is to some extent an artifact of the modeling structure in the assumptions that go into what impact might come from a bike lane based on the research that's been conducted in the literature. But I do think in general, this is highlighting that the greatest impact per dollar spent when you're talking about walking and biking infrastructure, it's most cost effective in these urban areas. And we see that in this analysis also when we look at it geographically in a map form. And again, this is the county level, but you can see this concentration in the I-95 corridor, which is the densest population area on the East Coast. And the greatest impact is found in New York City, which is the most dense area. And I've kind of blown up for this presentation the Boston area, the MAPC region, basically. And you can see also the same thing kind of runs true here in Suffolk County. It's the highest number of deaths avoided per 100,000 people. One caveat to this I would point out, though, is all this analysis is done at the county level. And therefore, you take a county like Norfolk County that has less dense areas and more dense areas that are closer to Boston. And all of that's kind of aggregated and averaged out into one value. And so we would definitely expect to see, if we looked at a finer level of analysis at a sub-county level, that you'd see certain areas of these counties that are denser that would have greater impacts and per dollar invested in walking and cycling, and then parts of the county that would have less. So just key findings, and then happy to have a discussion and answer any questions I can. The large potential mortality benefits that we kind of note here and that we analyzed here associated with this ostensibly climate change focused policy are notable. This is health impact that's coming from something that's really geared to be a climate change policy. And that's important to recognize when doing analysis or cost benefit analysis when we're thinking about these types of policies. There are benefits to health from transportation policy or climate change policy. Another thing to note is the deaths avoided from activity are much, much larger than traffic fatalities. That's why all of these are net positive, right? In terms of, I'm using my finger and you can't see that. That's why all these are net positive in terms of deaths avoided. They're not negative numbers because the benefits from increased activity are much greater than the potential costs, loss of life from increased fatality rates. As I know, the monetized benefits exceed the direct investment costs for all the scenarios. I didn't talk about this here, but when we look at these benefits, these mortality impacts compared to our colleagues that are doing research on air quality, it looks like the active mobility benefits from increased physical activity are greater than the air quality impacts. And that is interesting, and it's consistent with what other research has shown that's looked at similar type of work. And I think one of the reasons why that's the case is because, you know, when we bike or walk, we're switching from a car mode typically, right? So we're reducing our emissions profile, but we're also increasing our own physical activity. And so there's this dual benefit of reduction in pollution and increase in individual or physical activity and individual health. And that's having this multiplicative effect on our health. I think it's, yeah. The other thing I was mentioning, as I already talked about, is the benefits are concentrated in these urban areas due to the cost effectiveness of the investment in dense areas and the modeling structure. That's kind of our research, but I do think it's worth noting for you that, the perspective that it might be worth considering, is cost effectiveness the most important thing, or is it the only thing that matters? And I say that because most cost effective may not also be the most equitable. And there's evidence in the literature of systematic underinvestment in walking and cycling infrastructure in communities of color. Also, we tend to build bike lanes where there's already high levels of biking because it's infrastructure, it's kind of purpose built for people who are biking. But that also ignores potential for growth of new communities and new mode share. The other thing is, we noted kind of the concentration in these urban areas. It is worth considering, should bike lanes and sidewalks only be built in urban areas because it's most cost effective, or should we also be building those in suburban and rural areas? Other countries have dealt with this very differently. Some countries build cycle tracks all throughout rural areas. And so it's worth kind of thinking about this and being open to the idea that cost effective may not be just itself the best outcome from an investment perspective. We average all of this work at the county level, but the biggest benefits would definitely come from targeting the least active. So if you go from no activity to medium activity, there is greater impact on your health than going from medium activity to high activity. And so if we're thinking about this from a social perspective or from population perspective, like who are we targeting, it makes sense to look at where there are opportunities to improve activity levels for those who are less active, because that's where we'll get the biggest health impact and have the greatest impact. And then also, as I kind of already mentioned, there's a great question about this. Safety in numbers is an important factor here. And I think it's compelling because there's potentially this cycle between risk, perception, and safety. And so getting more people to bike or walk may improve their safety, reduce fatality rates. And by reducing fatality rates, people will be more likely to walk or bike. And there's survey research that suggests that the reason why people don't bike in particular is because they're afraid. They're afraid of getting hit and they're afraid of injury. And so as we improve safety through investments in infrastructure or safety in numbers or other factors, it's possible that we can collectively kind of as a society tap opportunities to increase mode share for people who otherwise would be too nervous or too afraid or not confident enough to bike, and now feel safe to do so because we have a safe environment for cycling. And I think that to a lesser extent goes for walking, and the safety in numbers research has been expanded to look at pedestrians as well. And so we talk about that a little bit in the paper. So with that, I will stop and take any questions and hopefully have a discussion with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matthew. And so John, you're up. Joe McQueen.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Len. And Matthew, thank you. This is really valuable stuff, especially for providing reasons and justification, let's say, for advocates to increase and improve walking environments and biking environments and complete streets and off-road bicycling, let's say, or pedestrian and bicycling facilities. To that off-road aspect, one of the obstacles, let's say, looking at rail trails, which are a large part of maybe not the urban, but the outer urban and inner suburban bike and ped environments are rail trails. And one of the bigger obstacles is getting right of way, securing rights of way. And is that reinvestment in the infrastructure able to be put against purchasing rights of way, or is it just for supplementing pavements or signage or traffic, crossing areas, things like that? And is it able to, or is it able to be applied to some of the initial designs, which for some cities, for instance, Framingham, they're up against a purchase of right-of-way and getting funds for design for their extension on the Bruce Freeman. So anyway, just thought I'd ask you that.
Yeah, I'm afraid I actually don't know the answer to that one. I think it's under discussion as to what Transportation Climate Initiative, where the resources will go and what programs it'll get channeled into. So I don't believe that it's determined at this point. And therefore I can't answer it, but it also means that there's probably, an opportunity to influence that process in some way. I do know there are federal programs for specifically what you're talking about, which you're probably more familiar with than I am. And so one of the things that we did not look at, because I don't think we knew who was going to be president when we started this research, was the federal role here and what federal resources are happening. So that's just something to note. None of this takes into account this infrastructure proposal that's before the House and the Senate right now. So that may also affect it. But in general, the way we've been thinking about it is money is somewhat fungible in the sense that more resources for active mobility from one bucket means there, maybe more resources in another bucket. And therefore, all of this is kind of relevant for all of these questions.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. Andy?
So I'm gonna take a second draw from the drink, I guess. One thought that I had just kind of hearing you talk a little bit about kind of the concerns about the underinvestment in particular in communities of color. One thing that I've been hearing is there's that piece, which is that, whether you're considering just from a more of a housing redlining perspective or kind of what that means for municipal funds and things like that, there is clearly a link between historic underinvestment in particular communities, and it's a very racialized kind of experience. But what I have been hearing recently that I think is also important to consider in terms of the safety in numbers kind of idea is that it kind of doesn't accept that there are some extreme things that happen in society in terms of whether people feel comfortable in their race to be out in public. And so whether you're talking about over policing or some of the other things that have come up this past year, there is a racial or an ethnic perspective when it comes to when you say safety in numbers, there is a question of safety for whom and what does that actually look like. So I know this is an infrastructure related kind of climate initiative, kind of, developing some tools around that. But I can't help but also make a comment in saying that, it is important to have the infrastructure, but there's also questions if you kind of disaggregate data on a racial level, you'll see that even activity by different racial categories isn't the same. And there is an important difference there that, for myself as an Asian American recently, being out in public has not felt particularly safe. And I can only imagine what that means for other racial groups in the United States. So while as a planner, I love talking about infrastructure, I also think that we also in this group have to sit with the idea that there's other non-infrastructure, non-planning aspects that we need to be aware of. So really appreciate all this, though. I love where this is going nonetheless, but I just kind of had to make that comment because we could lose that point if I didn't bring it up.
Thank you, Andy. So I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'll ask a few myself. Well, first, a couple of requests. So if we could get the slide deck, that would be very helpful, because even though this was recorded, there's just something about the Zoom format that makes it harder to read them. The resolution is kind of poor. So if you are cool with that, if you can mail them to myself and Matt, we can get them to the rest of the group and post it on the website. And I'm definitely interested in the larger framework in which this is Trek. You mentioned, I wasn't aware of that, but I am usually almost always interested in the greater framework. So any link to that, or maybe if I just look it up. If I put it in a browser, I'm going to find out pretty much what you would send me.
Yeah, but I'm happy to send it. I'll send you an email with both.
Okay,
no problem.
Great. So thanks, Mina. And so you had that graph about how there's the tipping point being for cycling. Hey, is there one for walking?
I haven't. Pat, are you still on? I don't know if Pat's seen anything, but I haven't seen a similar analysis for walking, which it's an interesting point because you have to do more walking to get the same level of exertion as biking, and therefore you're out in the environment more, but also your heart rate may not be as high and your respiratory rate might not be as high, so you're not taking as much air as cycling. So it could go either way. I'm not totally sure, but that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I asked because I do a lot of walking, and given where I live, I do a lot of walking along Mass Ave, in Cambridge and in Arlington, and so I rarely smell any fumes, but just because you're not smelling something doesn't mean that you're not inhaling something, and so I was just wondering if there might be some analysis along those lines. But thanks. And the last question I have is: are you willing to, or can you possibly quantify some of the other positive effects that are short of mortality? Because you kind of hinted at that in the paper that there's some mental benefits from increased activity. Is it possible to give a sense of how much that would contribute to the overall benefit of more active transportation?
Yes, great question. We didn't do that for the region, but our next phase, and Pat actually wrote a note here, is to look at the Boston area specifically and to do a finer level analysis. So that's something Pat and I are thinking about doing, and we're trying to work in not just mortality, but also morbidity, which would be, incidence of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, mental health impacts like you were talking about, depression and other factors. So looking at the development of, or incidence of those illnesses as opposed to just fatalities, mortality.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're doing
Great.
that likely in the next phase.
Great. So I see Chris Porter now has his hand up.
Yeah, hey Matt, great presentation, thank you. It just reminded me, we were talking about the near road air pollution or exposure of cyclists. A number of years ago, I remember, I think maybe through the Cambridge Bike Committee, we were connected with some researchers at Harvard that were handing out little portable monitors that they had people carry around with them. And I remember riding around with them on different roads, and it was supposed to monitor air pollution exposure, and they were going to relate it to traffic and all that. I was wondering if you knew if anything came of that, because I don't know if I've ever heard of anything specific that came from that.
I'm not sure if anything came of that, but I have seen similar studies, I think, that have looked at personal monitors like that. But I'm not sure, I couldn't cite you results. That's I'm not totally sure.
Sure, I assumed you weren't around or weren't.
I was not around and wasn't part of that one. But yeah, it might be worth following up with researchers.
Sure.
We just note, this is Pat Kinney. We did a similar study in New York when I was at Columbia University, that the results of which are just coming out now, where we equipped cyclists with air pollution monitors and looked at sort of the exposures and the health effects of that experience.
Great. Well, this has been great, you know, and I saw Pat's invitation for more engagement, and I'm definitely all for that. I mean, my understanding is that you all are doing some work already with members of CTPS. I mean, so maybe we can find out more about what's being done so that we can coordinate. And as you said, I mean, the money is rather fungible, and so if we don't get any of the monies from the TCI, then the state will, and that might, well, it could impact how we spend the federal dollars that we get, which are very limited. You know, and we are, I mean, one of the things we're wrestling with now is that we had cost increases of our projects that had been planned. So essentially we had no money to program for the 5th year of our current TIP. So we're trying to work out how to avoid having that happen. I mean, and so some of us feel that smaller projects are less likely to have significant overruns that would overwhelm our budget for any given year. I mean, so even if they do have cost increases, we wouldn't have maybe 1 or 2 that would just eat up the budget for that year. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the whole point is that these smaller projects might just work out better. Sorry about the background noise. We have another meeting going on. So yes, let's stay in touch. I mean, and I'll definitely stay in touch and as an individual, but also as a part of RTAC, and maybe coordinate with whomever at CTPS you're working. So with that, I'm going to ask once more for questions from participants.
Len, I believe we have a question from Wig Zamar.
Okay, I didn't see his hand up, you know, but sure, thanks.
Yeah, hi everybody. So I started the cafe research at Tufts, and a lot of folks at BU are actually familiar with it. John Levy's on some of our papers. Kevin Lane has got 1 paper left that we're hoping he'll do with structural equation model. And I also have been teaching active transport exposures at Harvard for a little more than a decade, just as a guest lecturer. And I tend to rely recently a lot on the Danish cohort study, which included the whole adult population of Copenhagen and Aarhus, and found much higher levels of mortality in the cyclists who lived in the 10% of Copenhagen and Aarhus, which had the most mobile pollution. This isn't PM 2.5, it's local pollution. And they have much less diabetes mortality, but they have much more cardiovascular, lung cancer, and overall mortality. And this was a whole population study. And it's a pretty thorough study. This is an offshoot. Mark Nieuwenhuizen's on the paper from Barcelona, who's pretty well known for trying to balance exposures and active transport in Barcelona. So you might want to look at that. It's pretty conclusive. And I think the really telling point is that the people who lived in the cleanest half of Copenhagen and Aarhus and got absolutely no exercise had a lot lower mortality than the cyclists in the 10% most polluted part of the cities.
Anyway,
Thanks for that.
Thank
you, Len. Yeah, and thank you for the presentation. I agree with 90% of what you said. I think you got to be careful on the spatial temporal frame of the analysis and make sure it exactly fits, or exactly as closely as possible fits the exposures. And in the Copenhagen and Aarhus studies, certainly I think the at home and at work exposures are part of that. It's not just the cycling, but the folks who got exercise from gardening and athletics had much better outcomes than the people who were active transport and on road.
All right, Wig, thanks. And I'm just saying, when you lean into your mic, it causes distortion. You know, when you lean into your laptop, it causes distortion. Just so you know, no problem.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So I'm John Strauss.
Yep, thank you very much. Just had to unmute. Thank you very much. I'm John Strauss, a member of the Burlington, Massachusetts Town Transportation Town Meeting Transportation Committee. And the question I wanted to ask was started in the chat, which Patrick mentioned the ability to evaluate or model transportation scenarios. So I was just curious if we had a transportation scenario that we would like considered, do we send it to you directly, or is there a program that we would send this in and have it evaluated?
I guess that I'm Pat. I'll take that since I'm the one that stuck that in the chat. Yeah, I think reach out to me and or Matt, and we can communicate it with our group, the group that Matt talked about, which is collaboration involving Harvard and also UNC and Columbia. And we're in the midst right now of trying to figure out what scenarios are most interesting to look at for the Boston Metro case study. And so understanding what various groups, municipal groups or advocacy groups or others, interest groups that are interested in transportation, which scenarios are of interest is very relevant right now for us to try to, zoom into what we're going to do next.
That would be great, because Burlington has it's kind of a dispersed area. So when you try to think about transportation and you think about access, it's a very interesting problem. You can't just throw something at it and say, say, for example, in Lexington, where they have a center, there's really no center in Burlington. And that's true of some other towns, Wilmington, Linfield, et cetera. So yeah, now, do you guys have an email, or is there a way actually to get something to you?
Matt, you want to put your email or mine in the chat?
Okay.
There it is. There it is. Yeah.
Thank you. And that was also so interesting to hear about the savings in mortality, because you always hear about the environmental benefits, and it's always sort of pie in the sky type of thing. But it's actually fantastic to see a study that says, yes, this actually does save lives. And it's in a way that you don't think it's going to, by just keeping people healthier. So a very, very interesting perspective. I'm so glad that I came to this particular presentation. Thanks again.
And we're happy to have you, John. And just to let you know, and maybe Betsy Harvey, she's still here, can speak to this. I know that the MPO is going to do scenario planning for its next long-range transportation plan, and so you can feedback to CTPS, the MPO, about what you think should be involved in some of the scenarios that we will explore as part of determining how to formulate the next LRTP. So there's that avenue.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
No problem. So I'm just I don't know if Anna Christina wants to vocalize some of the issues that she's been putting in the chat regarding ADA, and I don't feel as if I can, because I haven't read them very closely. If she doesn't want to, I'm not going to force her to. She can raise her hand if she wants to. I'll just jump in on microphone. Yeah. Okay. You're. I think your mic's open. You can talk, Anna.
I was just wondering, if you foresee, if we put all this effort into the infrastructure for bikers, it would be nice to see them also include wheelchairs or people with disabilities accessing the same lanes, or would that cause issues as far as, accidents with the wheelchairs, because bikers can be fast? That makes sense?
It makes sense to me, but it's kind of outside the purview of the work that we did. But the question about what about ADA is a really good one, and I think that in concept, some of the Complete Streets programs are including, for example, like curb cuts and sidewalks, as a core component of Complete Streets investment. But I suspect others, you all probably know better than I do on that front. But as far as the investment structure, hypothetical investment portfolio for TCI, it does include Complete Streets investments. So theoretically, it might be part of that if the towns and state choose to invest the resources that way. But I think, I don't know, you guys know more about this stuff than I do, but I would think Complete Streets would incorporate some of that ADA concern into the modeling and the approach that they take.
And I would say certainly anything that we can do to make it easier for people who are mobility challenged to get to transit could help, because that could be part of it. And this is maybe a little tangential, but we have seen that things that we have done to help those who are challenged with mobility often helps everyone else. So almost everyone uses a curb cut rather than step down that block. And it helps parents who are pushing their kids in carriages. So there's certainly a benefit to everybody. So I'm glad to hear Anna and Christina bring that up and look for ways to incorporate that into active transportation. So with that, I think we're going to move on to our next chapter in the needs assessment. So once again, Matthew, thanks for being so open to talking with us, and thanks to your colleague or your advisor. And we all know advisors are colleagues too, especially in the academic world. So Mr. Kenny, so we'll stay in touch. All right, you can hang around if you want, but you're also free to go. Okay.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. So folks, I think we're going to move on to chapter 8, needs assessment. It was on transportation equity. I thought it was a really good chapter. If anyone has anything that they want to say, comment, ask. Okay, and well, I'll also say, if you could use the raise hand function, because I can't see everyone, but if you use the raise hand function, I have a list of participants, and when you raise your hand, then you pop up to the top of the list, and then I know that you want to speak. Okay, and to use the raise hand function, at least in my client, you go to reactions and then raise hand. So that's that. So let me pull up my notes right here. Okay. So I guess my first request. Oh, Sean McQueen.
Hi. Are you sure, Lynn? Do you want to go ahead or?
No. I want you to go first, please.
Oh, okay. Thanks. In just looking through, some of the appendices and such, a couple items. Number in 12A12, which is referring to West Station and I-90 and things like that. I think if it might be helpful, given the climate of opinions now and maybe design, for them to refocus and redefine the West Station with no layover and it being able to facilitate regional and reverse commuting as a hub, especially with the inclusion in the project of Grand Junction and its potential usage of DMUs or EMUs, whichever energy source they might have. But I think that's worthwhile, and I think that's close on the horizon and hopefully much earlier than 2040. A13, which is
this is appendix, John. You're doing the appendices, but we're just doing chapter. We're just doing chapter 8.
Yeah, this is chapter 8 was basically the appendices.
Oh, I just read chapter 8. I didn't read the appendices. So
yeah, I mean, it really was. I mean, it was all implementation, right?
No, it's transit equity.
Next steps in implementation.
No, this is chapter 8 in needs assessment. It was transportation equity.
Okay, all right, okay.
Yeah.
All right, forget it.
All right.
Actually, with the transportation equity, I guess one comment would be for us to reimagine the ride service, which they refer to, and I don't know if it's in the equity, but to remove that from the MBTA responsibility and reassign it to Health and Human Services.
What was that again?
regarding the ride service,
Okay.
which I guess might impact equity and inclusiveness, remove it from the MBTA's responsibility and funding
Mhm.
and reassign it to Health and Human Services.
That's an interesting idea because it was an unfunded mandate, and which is why one of the reasons the T has been struggling with it. Go ahead.
It'd be $100 million basically
Yeah.
that the T could use and have more targeted. When Health and Human Services, I think, they already have a transportation arm, so
Right.
it could be put in then. And just that's an idea. Huh. Bye.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's fine. So, but I hope you are able to read chapter 8 because I think you would see something interesting in it. So I guess it's a little confusing, but right now we're all these chapter references are to the needs assessment and not to the plan itself. So, all right, Matthew Peterson. I saw you had your hand up. Maybe we put it down. Maybe saying it's down. Okay. You want to say something, Matthew?
I was just, I mean, if you, I wanted to stay on topic. So I was just going to comment on the thing that John had said, but I can.
Oh, you can comment on what he said. That's fine. Go ahead.
Oh, I just say, like, I think it also makes sense. That's an very interesting idea to talk about just because currently, because of the way that the ride is ADA paratransit and is linked so closely to the specific transit routes that the MBTA provides, I think that if you move it to a different agency and kind of have a different way to look at it, you could actually have a much broader and more expansive view of how to provide it as well as an integrated service rather than just being exclusively connected to the transit provider. So,
right, gotcha. Well, there is this other program that runs parallel to the TIP, and I'm actually going to ask. I think it's Betsy's in charge of it to come and talk with us about it later on this year. It's like the coordinated human transportation, and then there are like 3 more letters after that, and it I think it play a big role in helping people with mobility challenges to get around more easily. So let's have that conversation and see how that fits in with some of the things that folks are talking about now. I thought I said Andy's hand up, and I think it's now down. Yeah, no, it's still up. Andy?
Yes. So I know I see Betsy there on the list of participants, so maybe I can ask the question to Betsy at one other point. But I was taking a look at how the transportation equity populations are defined, and one of the things that came up for me when I was looking at that definition was, at least on the maps, right? It's primarily transportation analysis zones or geographic areas where a particular threshold is applied to, and if a particular geographic area is above that threshold, then that's considered like a minority area or an area with more than typical limited English proficient populations and such, and there's a number of them. One of the things that I've been thinking of and just kind of sitting with is, primarily that it's not necessarily always the equity issue isn't necessarily when there's a large community, although that is one part of it. It's sometimes also the question of, what if you have like an isolated pocket of a particular group of people, and it may not necessarily be more than the regional average, and how you also try to establish equity in situations like that. So whether there's a racially or ethnic community that's just kind of in one corner of a town or a city in the region, and in Cambridge's case, in my work, there's a Somali and Eritrean population here that wouldn't necessarily show up as more than the average, but that's one particular immigrant community that we have made efforts to make bridges with. And so thinking about some of those other groups, and not necessarily immigrant groups, but other groups like this, that it might be something interesting to think of. So, just thinking about that as kind of a problem and kind of proposing that seems like something maybe in the next plan we could kind of start to find ways to talk about that and what we do to kind of make sure that we're not also recreating some of the inequities that we see because there's different populations that don't meet these thresholds. So that's kind of just a general statement and a thought and a hope, but that's something that when I was reading, that I kind of noticed I was thinking about a lot.
Thank you, Andy. Now I see Betsy has her hand up. And
Thanks, Len. Hey, everybody. Thanks, Andy, for your comment. Actually, this was really great timing to hear your feedback because we're starting the needs assessment again for this year, for the next plan. And I do agree with you, and it's a really difficult kind of, I guess, mathematical challenge in a way, or logic challenge of how do you, because, you know, you're absolutely right, and certainly from a legal perspective and from ethical perspective, need to consider impacts to any population group that's been underserved or vulnerable, and no matter what size it is. And you know, I'm definitely trying to think of new ways to visually show that, and to also kind of not just look at the people, but the impacts as well, right? I mean, on one hand, it's good to have some information about where different populations live and kind of the extent to which they may be vulnerable, but then also taking the next step throughout kind of the rest of the needs assessment. Okay, then what are the impacts generally on different population groups? And it's sometimes a question of scale too, of, you know, if we're looking at things regionally, but then impacts are local. So it's a challenge, and I do appreciate any and all feedback or suggestions as to how we might think about this differently in a way that's useful, because at the end of the day, like, this information is meant for the MPO so that they can make better decisions. So glad to hear this discussion.
Yeah. And getting at Andy's point, and with our desire generally to try to integrate our regions, make our communities more diverse. To the extent we are more successful at that, then the more things are going to get dispersed. So any given TAZ will have perhaps less lumpiness with respect to any particular group, and therefore won't reach that threshold that makes it a TZ. So if that's where Andy was headed in his thoughts, then I'm headed in the same direction. If not, well, then that's my independent thought. Some other things I had to request or suggest is that there's mention of the transportation equity program, and there's, I mean, I feel I know what that is, but I think if we could create like a page or a link on the MPO's website, for that program, to give people a good sense of everything that's going on in that program, it would be helpful, because there isn't any one spot I can see there. You can go on the website and see what's involved in transportation equity program, and some of the figures later on in the chapter where we're showing the accessibility or the availability to various populations, for like access to bikes or access to rapid transportation, where you have like elderly versus young, or minority versus non-minority. I think it would be really good if we could give the significance for those differences. I know it's a bit more work to do that, but essentially the p-values, so that when they're far apart, it's really clear that it's statistically significant. But when it's a little bit closer together, it isn't really clear. And so I think it's in general a good practice. I know it's more work, but I think once you kind of set up the work, it's kind of easy to replicate it, because you just kind of plug in the numbers. But maybe I'm a little naive on how easy that might be, but to the extent you can do it, that's a request. And maybe this is something to point out to Anne McGann, but on the error, there's in figure 811 on page 813, there's an error in the legend that makes it really hard to read. So you can figure it out when you look at the others, but the labels are compressed a bit, so that it leaves 2 or 3 or maybe 4 of the bars without any label on them. So I have a bunch more notes that I took, and I'll probably write them up or have a conversation with Anne McGann on my own. about it, but I thought it was a really good chapter in that respect. And so I'm going to stop talking now and address the two people who have their hands up. First, I have Chris Porter.
Yeah, hi. So I know the MPO and as well as MassDOT have been looking more and more at accessibility-based measures. And I think, and I know, right now we're working with kind of existing data and technology, but in the long run, I think it'd be great, when we describe existing conditions to be able to measure accessibility from bicycle infrastructure and transit and whatever, as opposed to just what infrastructure is actually in the neighborhood. And by accessibility, I mean, how many jobs, how many healthcare destinations, how many, essential destinations can you reach within a X minute travel time? And it's more complicated with bicycling because, you have to take into account, the quality of the route. So, but there are measures and methods out there where people are looking at, how many destinations you can reach by a high quality or low stress bike route. And I think that would add a lot of value to the equity analysis if it's something that can be done in the future.
All right, Chris, thank you. Anna Christina?
Sorry. I just was, to go back to, if you're interested, there is a really good, like a lecture coming up at the Volpe Transportation Center on low carbon transportation initiative for equitable transportation. I can send you the link. Or I'll put it in the chat for anyone that's interested.
All right.
That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So yeah, I'm going to stop here because I have a lot more notes I've taken, but I need to consolidate them a bit more. And like I said, it might be just more helpful to have a conversation with Ann about them. But I will say that I'm interested in the economic vitality goals, and in light of the work that we've done with the next iteration of the criteria, and I'm going to look at that more and see if there's a way for us to help give us some guidance as to how we select projects, because economic vitality is important, but it does get a little mushy, for lack of a better word, So I'll leave it there. So yeah, I'll just stop for now and look once more for questions. Not seeing any, I'm going to move on. And thank you, Betsy, for your input. Okay. All right. So next thing is I'm going to hold off and give the chair's report right now because I want to ask Matt something regarding our next meeting because we don't know whether we're going to have to meet in person yet, right?
That's correct. There will be tomorrow will, excuse me, I apologize, frog in the throat. Tomorrow will largely dictate whether we will need to have at least some of our group meet in person at the next month's meeting.
So you're saying we get word tomorrow from the legislature or from the governor?
Correct, from the governor, yeah.
Okay, all right. So at that point, we'll have some information. So then I know that there's been some emails going on to members of the MPO board with respect to availability based on the notion that a quorum will have to meet in person. So I take it once we get some word, then you and or someone else, meaning from the MPO, will start mailing members of RTAC in order to determine what we need to do.
Absolutely. And
great.
if we want to talk about this just sort of in an open format, this is something that I met with Annette Demscher about yesterday. If there are people who I see in the chat, Anna Christina said she's willing to go in person. If there are some people who are willing to go in person, that would be great. This can be handled privately or publicly, however people would prefer. But it is also sort of a wait and see what happens. And then we also need to, the other component, regardless of how many people will need to meet in person, to meet an in-person quorum, It's how sort of hybrid meetings going forward are going to take shape for the advisory council. And that very much remains to be seen. And I think there will be a flurry of activity, depending on what happens tomorrow, there will be a flurry of activity. So obviously, Len, I will talk to you about that,
Sure.
and Scott, and try to keep all of the members informed as well.
Sure. And I mean, for me, it's I can meet in person, but the more important thing is to make this meeting as accessible to as many people as possible, and that's where I think the remote component is particularly handy, and it also have them recorded and put up on YouTube. And so with those two things, it's like whatever number have to meet in person, okay, we'll do it, and I'll be one of the people who will commit to doing it, especially in this position, as chair. So I see David Montgomery is hand up.
Yeah, hi, Len. Thank you. I just echo what you just said. I've had the same issues being floated in our town, and I just trying to take whatever opportunity I can to underscore that I think accessibility is key, because I think there are a lot of people who, for whom getting into Boston is a real challenge. I'm one of them. Logistically, it's so much easier not to have to do that. So I'd love to affirmatively state for the record that my strong preference would be that we continue to have this available to us. Thank you.
Welcome. So, all right. Well, so now I'll get back to the rest of the agenda, and that's the chair's report. And so for anyone but Andy Rieger, if I say Tweedle, do you know what I mean? Raise your hand. Is David's hand still up? I think he's still up from last time. And all right. So Andy, I think Andy knows. Andy, if you know, just give me a thumbs up.
I feel like it's familiar. I just don't know what it is.
Okay, all right. Then I'll give you the letters. It's TWLTL. All right. So Andy, you want to tell us what it is?
Sorry, you're talking about the road treatment with the two-way left turn markings.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Right.
So I just so there was a corridor study that was done by the NPO. It's like one of the annual kinds of studies that they do. And so I saw it. Maybe it's because it's the 10th one of them that I've read. And it is every time you read one of these things, you pick up a little bit more. And so I was like, I saw that, and I was like, I wonder if the transportation geeks have a way of pronouncing that. And sure enough, they did, it's Tweedle, but anyways, I'm not simply saying that because, I was kind of tickled by it, but I have to say that that Norfolk study, I think it's on Route 53, was a really interesting study, and I think there's a lot of potential in it for making it more pedestrian friendly, more bike friendly, and I asked a question about how it might facilitate some mixed use development. And I got a decent answer from the manager of the study, Mark Abbott, and then I got a follow-up email from Ben, I'm blanking out his last name, from MassDOT, and he told me more about how there is some real plans for mixed-use development, and requires some zoning changes, of course, but to me, this just kind of with a better understanding of how housing works. It gives me another way of helping to determine which projects to suggest that the MPO propose, because if a community or sets of communities are working on the changes that they need to make in zoning in order to allow for mixed use development, and we could have a better roadway system in the works, I think it makes for a better regional environment, because there may be regions that aren't in a position to have a lot of housing, for whatever reasons, but other regions that are. And if then we can devote the roadway dollars to helping out those regions, then it can develop more housing. It can help the housing situation in the region as a whole. So this is our TAC, and it is the MPO. And so I think we should all feel free and a sort of sense of obligation to think about things regionally. So I'm, like I said, I said in the meeting, I said now, having thought about it some more, I am kind of excited about that study, and I think we can do some things with it in terms of helping us understand what projects to pick, because I think it'll also give us a chance to look at before and after quite a bit. So there are certainly some components or some reasons for doing these studies for improving that area, and if we are to do it, then we can see if it actually had any impact. And so I kind of focus on that one study as my report, but I think it's enough. And if anyone wants to ask me anything more about that or anything else, I think we've only had one meeting since our last meeting. So that's about it. Andy?
I just wanted to make sure I understood. So the Route 53 study, I think is what you said. Is that a study in which they evaluated a Tweedle, a two-way left turn lane?
No, that was just like a part of it. And
Okay.
I think maybe they were saying that's not the best way to handle, certain intersections. I don't like them. I think the deal is that if you do it, if you have to do it, but if you have some other way of doing it, then let's not do Tweedles.
Yeah, no, I definitely, especially if you're in a business district, for example, even if it's more highway oriented, they're not necessarily always safer,
Yeah.
right? Especially for the very few pedestrians and cyclists you may expect there while they're there, because of just kind of it puts the drivers in a really difficult situation, needing to look out for a lot of different conflicts. So, I'm glad to hear that it was couched in some concern about what those other impacts may be. Because, I grew up in a place where they have a lot of Tweedle roadways, and it works because there's so little going on. But even then, I've heard of some really difficult situations with fatalities and such like that. So even myself, as much as I know the terminology, I don't necessarily celebrate the design if it's done in particularly not appropriate locations.
Right. No, I hear you. And no, one of the big things about the study was, at least that I took home from it, was that only one side, it's just like a 2-mile area, and only one side of it has sidewalks. So they're like, well, we should put sidewalks in and no bike lanes. So there's certainly ways to make things more pedestrian friendly. And I'm not sure if you can really add in public transportation in any meaningful way. But as I told you, Ben, I'm still blanking on his last name, from MassDOT, said that there is a significant a significant potential for some mixed use development. I think on one of the edges of Norfolk, so like in a neighboring town. So I see Christina has her hand up.
Oh, sorry about that. No, I was just going to, when you guys were talking, I was going to, some moment of levity, but I've had a ban left turn campaign going for years. I think left turns are really very dangerous. That's it, and I'm on record.
Okay. No, well, look, that is kind of one of the problems with the virtual meetings, when people are polite enough to raise your hands. Humor often depends on timing, and if you don't get your comment in at the right time, then you kind of lose it. So let me just tell you, Anna, you're free to interject your humor anytime you want. All right, just turn on the microphone and go for it. All right. So Matt has suggested that I tell you all about the ad hoc committee. We met for the first time, and we're really just trying to figure out how we're going to do things. This ad hoc committee is to help us to determine whether and how to change policy, so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where the MPO has no money to spend in a given year. And it isn't so much that we need to spend money in order to give ourselves a reason to exist, but essentially the projects ended up costing us more than we thought they would. And so we just want to try to avoid having those kind of surprises. And when we put money into a project, we want to have a good idea that's what it's going to cost. So we had our first meeting last Thursday, and I think we're going to have our next one on next Thursday. And so I'll as things develop, there'll be more to report. So that's that on that. And we do have some minutes to approve from January 8th, 2020. And so I saw them today. I'm assuming they were out a while ago. So I'm hoping that anyone who wanted to read them had a chance to read them, and that someone is willing to make a motion to approve them, or at least point out if there are any things that need to be corrected. See Andy's hand up.
Sorry, I wanted to ask you about the previous statement that you just made before you got to the minutes.
Sure.
No, I just wanted to ask that ad hoc committee, it came out of kind of a difficult conversation, what I understand at the MPO, about the cost overruns. Something that I'm dealing with at work is the actual cost overruns, not cost overruns, increases in prices for a lot of things in the this kind of COVID moment. And so I'm wondering if that committee is also going to address that in any form, or it's just really trying to address kind of that first concern that came up last year.
Well, it's mostly the former, because we can't really hold people accountable for a shock to the system that then results in a really unexpected increased costs in materials, and maybe even labor. But we're having situations where things went from estimated costs at the 20% design phase to then when it's completely designed, being really different than what we thought it was going to be. So we're exploring notions like, do the MPO handle the design part of it? Because one of the issues that we have now is that we don't want to bail out on a community once we've given it a project, because they've already put a lot of money into design. And so, but if we take on that design cost, then if we decide, well, it was X at 25%, and now we designed it out and we see that it's way more than we thought it was going to be, well, we're not going to go through on it. Then the community can't say that, well, we spent this money on it. The community may have sunk other costs into it, perhaps come up with matching funds and spending some time in town meeting in order to get those funds, but it won't be like they spent the money out of their budget in order to do the design. So those is along those lines, Andy, so far.
Okay.
All right.
Interesting. I may need to ask you for some detail, but
sure.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. So, David?
Yeah, I was going to just respond to your question or statement about the minutes. I did look for them yesterday and didn't see them when I looked. I did see them today, and I've reviewed them, and I'm prepared to vote on them. But I don't know if others may have not had a chance yet, given the timing. I guess because it's happened a number of times, I just want to say it again, that I would prefer that they not get posted so late. For my preference, I would rather have them not posted at all. Wait till the next cycle if it's going to be that close to the deadline, because I often don't have that time to review them when it comes so close. So,
no, I hear you, and that's perfectly reasonable. And like I said, because I checked them today only, and I didn't know how early they had come out. So thanks for pointing that out, David. And so now the only reason I'm going to go ahead and move forward with this is because my assumption is that most people aren't going to read them anyways. And so if you had said that they just came out and you like to read them as we all should, and you didn't have a chance to read them and you appreciated if they were held back, I would gladly hold it back. That's not what I'm hearing you say, but I give you a chance to say that.
Yeah. What I will say is that it kind of goes hand in hand with how far we're behind on them.
Yeah.
So I'm eager to pass them too. I would encourage us to go forward today. But if we got closer to the current day, when what we're reading about is perhaps relevant to what we're studying now, I might feel differently. So
I hear you. I hear you. Yeah, I totally understand that. So, okay, well, yeah, I'll try and I'll do what I can on this front. So then, can we take that as a motion from you, David?
absolutely, I make a motion
right.
to approve the minutes as presented.
Thank you. Someone wants a second?
Second.
Thank you, Sean. And so I'm going to make this as painless as possible. And I'm going to say, if you have an objection, you either raise your hand or say something. Otherwise, we're going to let them go. All right, done. And so we have a minute for old business, new business. Member comments. Not to rush you. If you really have something to say, we'll go over it. But I'm just saying it's 4:14.
I think back in January, I promised to resign from the committee after 6 months, and so I think this is technically my last meeting. I'm not going to promise that you'll never see me again. I hope, in fact, I hope to see many of you in the future. But I did want to say this is I'm not going to promise to actually be at any meetings in the future anymore. So I did also want to say it's been a great experience working with all of you, and hearing all the different perspectives and questions, and learning a lot more about transportation planning from the inside, and all the interesting presentations that we've had over the years. So, but yeah, I do hope to see many of you in person again in the not too distant future.
Well, thank you, Chris. I mean, and it'll definitely be a negative on my watch to say that Chris Porter left me while I was chair. But I will miss you, and hopefully I won't miss you much, because you'll come back, and watch me. And even if you don't watch in real time, then you know how to get in touch with me, if you want an issue raised, or you want to suggest something to correct something. So thank you so much, and especially all your work on the letters in the 3C committee for the TIP and UPWP. And I don't know how we're gonna replace you, because not only did you contribute a lot in terms of your thoughts, but the letters you wrote were really, really good. You took what I thought was some pretty unorganized comments, and made them very cohesive and coherent. So thank you once again.
Yeah, thanks, Len. I appreciate that. And thanks for your leadership too.
Okay. So with that, we'll take a motion to adjourn.
Len, could I quickly say something? I apologize.
Sure.
I received a message from one of the members here, and I just wanted to make it clear to the advisory council members and other people who were perhaps not aware that Carl Quackenbush, the former executive director of CTPS, passed away in February. And I'm sorry if this was not made clear to members. It was unexpected, and it was obviously an emotional toll for people both at CTPS and the MPO. And if any of you were not aware, then I truly apologize for not making that more clear. And that's it.
All right. Thank you. So with that, we'll take a motion to adjourn.
A motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Anna Christina. Second.
Second.
Thank you. So thanks, folks. We'll do chapter 9 in July. We're probably not going to have a meeting in August. Almost certainly won't have a meeting in August. And so that's it.